New York, Ohio gozaimasu to those joining from Japan and across the world for a very exciting virtual crafting the perfect sake in Kanagawa. I'm really looking forward to this. It seems like with quarantine stretching on, we're stuck in a state of constant Groundhog Day. But today we get to break out of that cycle. I'm Joshua Walker from Japan Society. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of your time with us today to talk about one of the big and hot topics out there in the world, sake, and how it's made and where its kind of perfection comes from in Kanagawa. Our co-organizers tonight, the Kanagawa Prefectural Government, the Kikkoman Corporation, our Food Talk series sponsor, and the Talks Plus season sponsors, Mitsubishi UFJ, Financial Group, Anonymous Donors, and the Sandy Heck Lecture Fund. We have a lot to talk about today. The good news is I'm going to be able to just sit back and watch just like all of you, because we have real experts in the house tonight that have taken time from their busy schedules, both here and also in Japan, where a lot of the perfection comes from. This program, as you know, is part of our broader Get to Know Kanagawa virtual series. You can also enjoy an exhibition of Kamakura Bori woodcrafts, a virtual pop-up shop, and essays on Kanagawa attractions from the comfort of your home. As you may be stuck inside, don't let that keep your mind in the prison. We encourage you to enjoy the abundance of Kanagawa, which is one of my favorite prefectures in all of Japan. Without further ado, let me turn it over to our speakers, but let me introduce them very quickly. They don't actually need much of an introduction. Anybody who knows sake knows these gentlemen. First, we'll hear from John Gauntner about sake in Kanagawa. Many of you know him. He's been at Japan Society longer than I have, for sure. He speaks at our annual sake lecture and tasting over the last 2 decades, and he's always a big draw. Thank you, John, for being here. He's a founding member of the Sake Export Association, and he's the authoritative author of a handful of books about sake, including Sake Confidential. So thank you again, and good evening, John, here in the States. Then we'll get a virtual tour of Izumibashi Sake Brewery with the president. And we're really excited to be able to introduce Yuichi Hashiba, who will be joining us today. He's a 6th generation president of Izumibashi Suzo Company Limited, founded in 1857, right around the time that U.S.-Japan relations kicked off. So I can't think of a better connection for tonight. And one of the few breweries in Japan that actually grows, harvests, and polishes its own rice for sake production. After that, we're going to be able to actually enjoy the abundance that we hear about and learn about. It will be followed by a sake and food pairing led by Mr. Gottner. Mr. Gauntner will introduce sake from Kanagawa and present the suggested foods to pair with them. So I hope you've brought your appetite and your interest, and at least are able to take notes if you don't have it right in front of you. Finally, we have Hitoshi Suzuki, and he'll explain more about the special online Get to Know Kanagawa series on behalf of the Kanagawa division of Jetro here in New York. So without further ado, let me please introduce and welcome Mr. Gauntner. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walker. Good evening, everyone. Or good evening for most people, good morning for some people. Welcome to this presentation on the sake of Kanagawa with a special focus on Izumibashi Shuzo. It's an honor for me to do this because I've actually lived in Kanagawa Prefecture for 29 of the last 32 years. I moved to Japan in 1988 and just a short stint in Tokyo for a couple of years. About 29 of about the last 32 years, I've actually lived in Kanagawa. So I know the prefecture quite well. And in truth, there's nowhere else I'd rather live. And that is a huge statement. It's also a true one. What I'd like to do now is share my screen, and this should make that happen. And I'm assuming that it did. So tonight we're going to talk about the sake of Kanagawa Prefecture. There actually is a bunch to cover, so I want to move on right away. So because we're virtual, it's kind of hard to know exactly to whom it is I'm speaking. I've heard that we have 632 people registered and listening to this, but I still can't see any of them. So I really don't know how many people know what about is I'm going to talk about. So in an effort to be as comprehensive and as thorough as I can, I'd like to start with the basics. Where is Kanagawa? Just start with that. And in short, it's just below Tokyo. Kanagawa Prefecture and Tokyo actually share a border. In fact, it's really one big conurbation, one huge metropolitan area. There's really no segue. The population really never thins out as you go from Tokyo into Kanagawa Prefecture. Furthermore, it's home to Yokohama, which is Japan's second most populous city. So that's where Kanagawa is. Again, it's a very industrial town, very well populated. and a place where I've lived for 29 years or so. Before we talk about the sake of Kanagawa, I just want to give you guys an understanding of what's going on in the industry in Japan, because that'll be a reference to Kanagawa. If you look at how many sake breweries are in Japan, about 100 years ago, 80, 90, 100 years ago, there were about 10,000 sake breweries in Japan, most of them very small. Sake production and consumption peaked in 1973. And back then, there were about 3,500 active sake breweries. When I got to Japan in 1988, there were actually 2,500 sake breweries. Currently, there's between 1,100 and 1,200 sake breweries that are active. If you look at Kanagawa, though, there's only 13 active breweries making sake in Kanagawa. That's the 5th lowest in Japan. If you look at some of the larger sake producing regions like Niigata, Nagano, Hyogo, they have more than 70, sometimes more than 80 breweries that are active. There's a lot of breweries in Japan, a lot of prefectures in Japan that have 40 or more breweries that are actively making sake. And there's just a handful that have less than 20. And Kanagawa is one of those. There's only 13 active breweries in Kanagawa right now. That's actually the 5th lowest in Japan. If you look at the 4 that have fewer breweries than Kanagawa, one of them is Tokyo, and Tokyo only's got half a dozen. But again, it's the biggest city in Japan, one of the biggest in the world. There's not a whole lot of room for sake breweries anymore, and not a lot of rice is grown in Tokyo either. But the remaining few that have fewer breweries than Kanagawa are all in the southwestern part of Japan and are generally in shochu distilling regions, or in the case of Okinawa, awamori distilling regions. So of the prefectures that brew mostly sake and not awamori or shochu, Kanagawa is just one of the fewest breweries in the prefectures with the fewest number of breweries in all of Japan. However, they do have a handful of breweries that are extremely popular these days. One of them is Izumibashi Shuzo, making the eponymous Izumibashi Sake. And again, we'll meet the 5th generation owner and president in a couple of minutes and talk a lot about their sake. Another one is Tensei, which is in Kanagawa Prefecture as well. These two are extremely popular and well-known all over Japan. There's a few more that are doing a good job of making a name for themselves right now. Zaruso Horai, Matsumidori, Sagaminada. While small, they're starting to get well-known outside of Kanagawa as well. A couple more would include Hakoneyama and Tanzawa-san. These are brands within Kanagawa that are starting to make a name for themselves. And then there's this one, which is interesting to me. The company name is Seto Shuzo, and they make a sake called, they actually have 3 brands, but the main one is Sakata Nishiki. And they were dormant for 40 years. In other words, they stopped making sake. They maintained their license by either making a very small amount or outsourcing the sake. And then last year, actually, I believe it was 2 years ago, a company that likes to reinvigorate small towns that have been fading came in and bought the brewery and completely revitalized it. So after 40 years of dormancy, this particular brewery came out. And I love seeing this in the sake industry. I'd like to say you see it more and more, but it's just a few isolated cases where you have breweries coming out of dormancy to start brewing sake again. But Kanagawa Prefecture, even though they've only got 13 breweries, is one of the prefectures who has a brewery that's come out of a long sleep in making sake. So it's really, really interesting to me. So of the 13 breweries I've mentioned, 8 so far, the other 5 are great breweries. They're just not as visible as the ones that we mentioned, and I'm sure that they'll become more visible as time goes on. There is actually signs of a formerly vibrant sake industry that did exist in Kanagawa Prefecture long ago. And one of the signs of that is a river that's called Sakawagawa. And the characters for Sakawagawa mean the scent of Sake River. And it got that name because there was so much sake that was brewed along the banks of that river long ago that every place smelled like sake. So they gave it the name that it smells like sake. So that was indicative of the fact that there was a vibrant sake brewing industry a long time ago. There's a mountain range in the western part of Kanagawa Prefecture called the Tanazawa Mountain Range. And the Tanazawa Mountain Range gives a lot of great water to all of Kanagawa Prefecture. It's fairly mineral rich, fairly hard water, not super hard, but, and it's really very, very good sake brewing water. You need to have great water if you're going to make good sake. And because of the Tanazawa Mountain Range, all of the breweries in Kanagawa do have a very good source of water. And that's something they got going for them, even if there's just a few breweries there. There's also a bit more about the history. There's a Shinto shrine called Oyama Ofuri Jinja. And in the Edo area, from the early 1600s into the late 1800s, it was like a pilgrimage destination. There were lots of people that would visit there all the time, kind of like modern bus tours to historical sites like that. And there were lots of places that sold a lot of sake because there were so many people walking the path up to this jinja, to this shrine. And so there's lots of sake sold there. So there is records of lots of sake being brewed and lots of sake being sold a long time ago back in Kanagawa Prefecture. However, again, it's a very, very densely populated and big consumer market. As such, what happened is, as industry developed in Kanagawa, the industrial development kind of overshadowed sake production. Furthermore, because it was such a huge populated region, from other regions, all kinds of good things came in. There was all kinds of sake coming in from the surrounding prefectures because it was targeted, as it was such a large consumer market. So really, the sake industry in Japan never had a chance to flourish and kind of got overshadowed by industrial development in that prefecture. And we looked at the numbers before, how we've gone from 10,000 to 5,000 to 3,500 to 2,500 to 1,200 breweries over the past 100 years. So in every prefecture, the number of sake breweries has been dropping off. And it dropped off in Kanagawa, just like it did everywhere else. So over the last 40 years, it's down to the lucky 13. And those are the only ones that remain in Kanagawa right now. Furthermore, Kanagawa, there is good rice grown in Kanagawa. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes because the guy who grows some of that very good rice is with us tonight. But in terms of comparison to other prefectures, it's not a huge rice producing region. If you were to look around at the major sake producing regions in Japan, they're all major rice producing regions. Again, you go up to the Tohoku region, which is the northeastern part of the main island of Japan, or down to Hyogo. These places are huge rice producing regions as well. And because there's lots of rice, you have lots of sake producers as well. So Kanagawa is not a huge rice producing region. And that probably affects why there's so few sake breweries as there are today. Another thing interesting about Kanagawa is there's no real clear regional style. If you look at some of the larger sake producing regions in Japan, or the regions that have lots of sake breweries, they will have, for example, a local guild of toji, a local guild of master brewers, and they will do things pretty much the same way. And they'll probably, at least historically, have been using the same types of rice. And certainly they'll have the same climate. And certainly they'll have the same traditional food in any event. And so the brewers of a particular region would end up brewing sake that was similar to each other, had some threads of consistency running through them because of the climate, because of the food, because of the mastered brewers and things like that. However, when you look at Kanagawa, there's really not enough breweries to have a style. And if you got 80 breweries in the prefecture, yeah, you can find an identifiable style. You know, when you've got 20 or 13 or something like that, it's kind of hard to find the thread of consistency running through them. So there really isn't a style, for example, light and dry or rich and big boned. A lot of prefectures have a style like that, but Kanagawa isn't one of them. And that's actually kind of a good thing. What it does is it allows the brewers in Kanagawa to be creative. They don't have a preconceived notion of how their sake should taste. And they've done a very good job of being creative in the styles of sake in which they brew. So to wrap this up, there's just a few breweries, but that includes some popular ones. All of them are trying very hard to do their best. And there's some that are leading some interesting trends in the industry as well. So we should all do our best to support Kanagawa sake, and we can do that by drinking it. So let's all do that starting tonight. Next, I'd like to talk a bit about Izumibashi Brewery, what it is that makes them special, and go from there. The brewing season in Japan typically begins in about October and runs until about April or May. Could be longer, could be shorter, depending on the scale of the brewery, but typically starts in the late fall and runs to the spring. And so the sake brewery at the brewing season in Japan is just getting started, but I've been to Izumibashi Shuzo twice already this season. So I'm well prepared to talk about it tonight. So what I want to talk about is some of the things that make them special. And one of the things that makes Izumibashi Brewery special is that they're in a city called Ebina, which is less than 1 hour from Yokohama. Again, Yokohama is the second biggest city in Japan, and really the population doesn't thin out as you go from Tokyo into Yokohama. But as you head towards Ebina, again, you're moving from one of the second biggest city in Japan, and you're only an hour out, but it's really close to metropolitan area. However, as you move from Yokohama out to Ebina, the big city fades and gets smaller and smaller. And interestingly, when you get to Ebina. Ebina is not a small city. It's a medium-sized city. And you can take the train to Ebina. And from Ebina, you can take a taxi to Izumibashi. It'll take you, I don't know, 7 minutes by taxi. Or you can walk. And if you walk, it's less than half an hour. It's a very nice walk. And I've done it twice already this season. As you walk from Ebina Station to Izumibashi Shuzo, all the buildings fade into rice fields. It just kind of transitions. It's a really, really cool transition from a city to a complete rice fields everywhere. And the closer you get, and when you get in the immediate vicinity of Izumibashi Shuzo, there's rice fields everywhere. It's a really, really interesting transition. And it's one of the things that does make Izumibashi Shuzo quite unique. Next, I'd like to talk about Mr. Hashiba himself. Mr. Hashiba, I believe, is the 5th generation, I believe, of his family to lead the company, the current president and owner. And when he came back to the company, and I'll talk about coming back to the company in a minute, in the mid-90s, the company was struggling. However, it wasn't just them. The entire industry was struggling quite a bit at that time. People were moving away from sake. Sake kind of lost its sheen. It lost its appeal for a lot of people. A lot of younger people looked at it as the old person's drink. In other words, it had no sexiness, no appeal. It's what the old folks drink. And in fact, that's still true today to a certain degree. A lot of younger people don't really see sake as appealing, and a lot of people in the brewery, in the industry, are still struggling. However, I think this was the beginning of it. It was much more challenging back then. When Mr. Hashiba came back to his company, he actually rejuvenated everything. Now, in truth, his father had started it. It wasn't like he changed everything on a dime. He just continued what his father's begun, but he really, really continued it with a very, very strong passion, a lot of energy. The reason I say came back to the company is because it's not uncommon for sake brewing families. Historically, it goes from father to son. It might go father to daughter, now go mother to daughter. There's all kinds of patterns, but historically it would go from father to son. And what they would do typically, or at least not uncommonly, is when the son would come home from college or whatever his last education level was, instead of joining the company right away, he would work in another sake brewery for several years to learn how other breweries did it, to kind of get a new view on things. Another pattern, and this is what Mr. Hashiba did, is he worked in a completely different industry for several years and lived away from the family home. So he lived in Osaka for a while in a completely different industry, which gave him some clear insights on how to do business that he would not have gotten had he just joined the company right away. So when I say came back, he was actually working in another industry for a while, and he returned to the company to step in as vice president and now president, and he started to further and enact the changes that his father had begun. So let's look at some of the things that make them really special. Mr. Hashiba mentioned this before. I'll mention it now. He'll probably mention it again when he speaks. But Izumibashi-san, Izumibashi Shuzo, they grow their own rice. And to me, I think a lot of people might say, well, that's not surprising. I mean, most sake brewers grow their own rice, don't they? And the answer to the question is no. Historically, yes. If you go back 100 years, most sake breweries had large tracts of land upon which they grew rice, and they used that rice to brew their sake. However, it doesn't work that way anymore. It hasn't worked that way since the early 1950s. The rice distribution system in Japan is very, very unique. Back then meaning 70, 80, 100 years ago, and before that, you had a lot of tenant farmers. In other words, you had people that owned large tracts of land, and farmers would live on the land and rent the land to grow the rice, and they would pay their rent in rice. For reasons that are beyond my understanding, that's economically not stable. So they changed that in the early 1950s. However, in order to prevent a return to the old system, in order to prevent a reconsolidation of farmland by big companies, the law became that you cannot be a company, a business entity cannot grow rice. Only farming families could grow rice. You couldn't be a company and a business entity of any kind. Then that rice is then distributed by agricultural co-ops. It's a system of agricultural co-ops that still exists in Japan. That's the reason sake breweries do not grow their own rice. Now, the law has changed a bit, and currently it is not necessary to purchase rice through the agricultural co-ops. So you can contract directly with a rice farmer and buy the rice direct. That made that a little bit easier. However, a company, a business entity, still cannot buy rice fields. There's just a handful of breweries in Japan, and Izumibashi is one of them, where they actually have sake breweries that can own and buy rice fields. The key difference is that these families that can do this were originally family farming families as well. So for example, the Hashiba family was a farming family as well as a family that owned a sake brewery. So they've always been able to grow their own rice. And now they're able to use the rice that they grow to make their sake at home. There's only a handful of families of brewing companies in Japan that can do this, and only just a couple that actually do that actually do grow their own rice and use it. We'll hear a bit more about that from Mr. Hashiba when we come back to that. But one thing that makes them special is they grow their own rice, and they grow most of their own rice. Not 100% of it. There's reasons for that, but they grow a lot of the rice that they use to make their sake. Another thing that makes them special is that they mill their rice in-house. Only about 10%, I believe, of all the breweries in Japan own a milling machine. The milling machines are extremely expensive. So there are other breweries that do this, but it's very rare. There's a number of reasons. The milling machines are extremely expensive. You have specialist millers where it's just easy. You buy your rice from a farmer, you ship it to the miller, they mill it for you, and it's done. You don't have to worry about it. However, rice is an agricultural product. It's going to vary from year to year in terms of moisture content or hardness or a bunch of things. So if you mill it in-house, you're able to make fine-tuned adjustments that will make it best for that year's particular rice. And Izumibashi pays great attention to the rice that they grow. After all, they do grow it themselves. So they take the time to mill it themselves as well. And there's very few breweries that actually do this. Another thing about their milling is they do it in a very special way that's known as henpei seimai. And to briefly explain henpei seimai, what it does, it's a very special milling method that allows you to mill the rice much more effectively. What that means is you take off much more fat and protein in the places where there are more fat and protein to mill away. Very briefly, because it's so interesting that I can't help myself, if you look at a rice grain, it's actually shaped like a football that's kind of squashed. It isn't round. And if you use a normal milling method, you mill it so that it comes be completely round. However, you end up leaving more fat on the sides where there's more fat to mill. If you can mill in such a way where you maintain the original squishy football shape, you're able to take off more fat and protein on the sides where there's more fat and protein to be milled off. So if you can do it that way, it's much more effective. You get to remove more fat and protein, which you don't want, with less milling. However, it's a hassle. It's much more complicated. It's much more labor intensive. It takes a lot more time. But to Izumibashi, it's important for them to mill their rice in that way. Again, they grow it themselves. They mill it themselves. They might as well mill it the best way that they can. So those are two things that make them special. Furthermore, another thing that makes them special is that they make only Jinmai styles of sake. Of the 632 people here today, I'm sure a lot of you know that all sake can be made using rice, water, and that moldy rice called koji alone, and that's the Jinmai styles, or you can add a bit of alcohol to that. And there's a lot of good reasons for adding distilled alcohol. You can make it more economically, or you can also bring out more flavor and give it a better shelf life. However, at Izumibashi, they make it only the Jinmai style. In other words, they take all the trouble to grow their own rice, mill it painstakingly at home. Of course, it's completely aligned with what they're all about to make rice-only sake. So everything they make is of the Jinmai variety, which is another important aspect of who they are. Furthermore, there's a type of sake referred to as Kimoto. And not surprising, it's very labor intensive. When sake is made, the first milestone in the sake brewing process is to make a yeast starter. It's known as a moto or a shubo. And the yeast starter is usually a very modern method that takes about 2 weeks. But there's a traditional method known as Kimoto that takes about twice as long to make. And it's a very, very interesting way of doing it. It's becoming more popular. And it usually leads to a somewhat tartar sake, a somewhat more richer sake, a very fine-grained flavor with a very, very unique acidity to it. And it's a great style of sake. It is becoming more popular, but it's much more of a hassle and challenge to make. But again, for Izumibashi, it's worth it to put their effort into this style of sake. So about half of everything they make is actually of the Kimoto style. A couple other things that make them extremely unique includes the fact that they use a lot of handcrafted steps. In other words, making of the koji, which is when you grow a particular mold on the rice that gives you enzymes for starch to sugar conversion, as well as amino acids that give you richness and umami. There's great machines that'll make wonderful koji, but without exception, let me rephrase that, almost without exception, the best koji is going to be made by hand. And at Izumibashi, they make all of their koji by hand. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of stress, but it's important to them to do it that way. Another step is the way they press their sake. When you ferment a tank of sake, because the rice is dissolving in the tank, after the month-long fermentation, you've got rice solids mixed in with the completed sake, and you need to filter out the rice solids. There's a big machine that does that with just a push of a button. And 99% of all sake is pressed using that machine. There's other ways to do it. And one of the more labor-intensive ways to do it is to put the fermenting mash in a cotton bag. Then you put the bag inside of a big box like that, and you squeeze the lid down and crank out the sake and leave the rice solids behind. That leads to much more expressive, vibrant sake. But again, it's a big hassle. It takes a lot more time and a lot more effort. But for Izumibashi, most sake breweries will use the big machine and only use this box press method for a couple of tanks. But Izumibashi, all of the sake they make is pressed in this labor-intensive way that gives them much more expressive sake. So these are some of the things that make Izumibashi special. One other thing is what I call the Akatombo Spirit. I actually coined that term myself about a day ago when I was putting together this presentation, the Akatombo Spirit. Akatombo is red dragonfly. Tombo is dragonfly. Akatombo is red dragonfly. And I didn't know this until I started hanging around with Izumibashi, but dragonflies are unique for a couple of things. First of all, a dragonfly is has a very special presence to martial artists and to warriors in ancient Japan. And one of the reasons for that is that a dragonfly physically cannot go backwards. They have to go forwards. I didn't know that. So it's always forward, never retreat. And that kind of philosophy is very much embodied by Izumibashi and Hashiba-san in particular. The dragonfly spirit, the Tombo spirit. Furthermore, those of us that have hung around fields and outdoors a bit, certainly there's various kinds of dragonflies. There's red ones, green ones, metallic blue ones. But if you look over a field of rice in Japan just before harvest, what you see is red dragonflies hovering around and cleaning out the insects there. So the red dragonflies are the ones that you find out about rice fields. So the always move forward, never retreat, dragonfly spirit is part of it. But the red one are the ones that hang around rice. And Izumibashi is all about rice. They grow it themselves, they mill it themselves. That's all they use in any of their sake. So the Akatombo has been chosen as their logo, and it's very, very representative of everything that they are doing at Izumibashi. So a very special brewery. They do a number of things that make them special. They grow their own rice. They mill their own rice. They make only Jinmai. They make mostly Kimoto. Their attention to detail in production is second to none, and they live by the dragonfly spirit. And we'll hear more about that in a couple of minutes from Mr. Hashiba. Before I hand it over to Mr. Hashiba, and then we'll move on to a virtual tour of the brewery, just a couple of things about Kanagawa. So if you were to look around Japan, every place in Japan has something for which they're famous. It could be lacquerware, pottery, artwork, tools, Japanese paper, but very, very commonly it's food. Almost every place has a food for which they're famous. Kanagawa does as well, but maybe not as pronounced or famous or well-known or as many as some other prefectures in Japan, because it's very long been a very densely populated consuming region. And when you're a big prefecture of consumers, all kinds of things come to you from surrounding prefectures. So there really wasn't much of a chance to develop their own local delicacies. However, there are a couple. The most well-known two, in my mind, are misaki maguro, or tuna, and something called shirasu, and both are great for sake. If you look at the map in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you see the same map earlier of Kanagawa showing the 13 breweries. In the lower right-hand corner, you see a peninsula that sticks out, and that's known as the Miura Peninsula. And just to the east of that is Tokyo Bay, and just to the west of that is Sagami Bay, and that thing sticks out, the peninsula sticks out in the Pacific Ocean. The very tip of that is a city called Misaki, and there's a fishing port there that's very famous for bringing in great tuna in from the ocean. So the tuna from Misaki Maguro is the tuna from Misaki, known as Misaki Maguro, is some of the most famous stuff in Japan, and it really goes very, very well with sake. The other thing is, if you go west into Sagami Bay a bit, to the Shonan area, there's something called shirasu, and it's basically baby infant fish, most commonly cod, but not exclusively. There's a number of ways to eat it. You can eat it completely raw, although that's very, very seasonal, hard to get, and just outstanding. Or you can get it steamed or baked, or a number of other ways to get it. It's one of the more famous delicacies of Kanagawa Prefecture, and it really goes very, very well with sake. So the two things for which Kanagawa Prefecture is probably most famous go very, very well with sake as well. So seek those out when you get a chance. So what I'd like to do now is move on to the virtual tour of Izumibashi Brewery. We'll do that in a second. And before we do that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Hashiba. Again, he is the 6th generation and current president of Izumibashi Shuzo. He'll say a few words, and then we will switch over and look at the video and the virtual tour with some commentary by Mr. Hashiba and myself. Mr. Hashiba, please take it from there.
Okay, thank you, Gottner-san. Good morning and evening to everyone. I'm an honor to be here with you tonight. I'd like to quickly introduce myself. I'm Yuichi Hashiba from Izumibashi Shuzo and the 6th generation of president. Before I get started, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Walker, Mr. Gauntner, Mr. Suzuki, Ms. Sekia, and staff in Japan Society in New York and Kanagawa Prefecture. They graciously helped me to bring this event together to be successful, and I deeply appreciate their support. When I started working at our brewery, I realized the importance of sake rice. I rejuvenated our brewery to cultivation brewery and 100% all pure rice brewery, which is very rare among sake breweries in Japan. In addition, I'd like to point out Izumibashi follows traditional sake making method. We will spare no effort passing delicious sake, although it may take more time and effort. We are also open to new technology to improve cultivation and brewing sake, such as drone data analysis, flat-shaped rice polishing. You will see more in my brewery tour. Okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We have 2 videos for you today. One is a short 2-minute video that shows rice growing and harvesting. And then we'll move on to the brewery tour itself. So if we could see the beginning, if we could start the rice video, please. So Hashiba-san, this is Rakufumai rice, is that correct?
Yes, Izumibashi staff is harvesting Rakufumai now. This rice is very new sake rice in Japan.
And I think you guys are the only brewery to grow Rakufumai, correct?
Yes.
Good. What else did I want to ask you? How many varieties of sake rice do you grow now?
Yes, we grow 4 varieties, and that is Yamada Nishiki, Rakufumai, Omachi, and Shinriki rice.
Yamada Nishiki, Rakufumai, Omachi, and Shinriki. Very interesting. So I believe that this combine will actually measure the amount of rice harvested, the protein inside the rice, and the moisture. So I guess you can determine which rice fields give you the best rice by doing it this way. Is that correct?
Yeah, we can choose the rice fields that's ideal for Jinmai Ginjo, Jinmai Ginjo, Jinmai Shu, etc.
Wow. So you can actually choose the rice field that's best for each grade of sake by measuring it with the combine, correct?
Yeah, yes.
Very interesting. How many rice fields do you grow rice in these days? And about how big is each one of the rice fields?
Yeah, Izumibashi Brewery has 460 rice fields in total. One rice field is 1,000 square meters, about 0.25 acres. This is in total 46 hectares, which is 115 acres.
115 acres of rice. Interesting.
You probably can't. Okay.
So we're moving on with no further ado to the actual brewing sake, the virtual sake tour now. So we'll be entering the brewery here. The reason they start so early is they need to steam the rice first thing in the morning to give it time to cool down, so that by the time they add the rice to the fermenting mash or the koji room, it's cooled down enough to not adversely affect the fermentation temperatures and things like that. Although it might be hard to see from the video, the brick pit beneath the steaming vessel here is where they would historically build a fire to boil the water that would go up through the steaming vat. So, Mr. Hashiba, we spoke several times how you grow your own rice and you mill your own rice at home, and that's very rare. Why is it so rare to find sake breweries that both grow their own rice and mill their own rice?
Okay. There were two regulations by Japanese government until recently. First is the brewery could not buy the rice directly from farmers. Second is breweries could not enter the agricultural business. So most breweries do not grow rice. And the next question, first of all, for rice polishing, there are less than 10% sake breweries have their own polishing machine. Second, most breweries are buying rice from another prefectures and outsourcing rice polishing because the rice polishing machine is expensive. And however, I think it's necessary to grow and polish our own rice to make good sake. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. So to me, this is amazing. Look at how precise they're going. They're getting to exactly 10 kilograms by just adding a few grains of rice. What they'll then do is wash the rice and soak it, and they'll weigh it after that, and it'll be able to very, very precisely tell how much water has been absorbed. The attention to detail is amazing. So here they're washing rice by hand. Mr. Hashiba, can you explain why washing the rice by hand like this is better than, for example, using a machine to wash the rice?
Okay. The water absorption rate of rice is a key factor in making good koji. Washing 10 kilograms of rice by hand allows us to control the water absorption rate more precisely than wash a large amount of rice at once by machine.
Excellent. Very interesting. While we can't hear this, while we couldn't hear it too well in the video, they were actually counting down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And they were measuring the time that the rice was soaked down to the second. That's how precisely this is all done. Mr. Hashiba, can you explain what he's looking at here as he holds those grains in his hand?
Okay. He can see how much water the rice has absorbed by looking at the color change. The rice changed to white color after the water absorption.
That's pretty amazing senses. I'm sure it takes him a long time to be able to do that. Okay, let's go on. So the rice is being steamed here, not boiled with water. In other words, they don't mix it with water and boil the water. They boil water beneath it and just blast steam up through that. Why is it done that way?
Unlike table rice, steaming the rice makes it drier on the outside and moisture on the inside, which is important for sake brewing, which called in Japanese gaiko nainan. Okay.
Very interesting. Thank you. And how much rice is in that vat? How much rice is in that koshiki?
Yeah, 500 kilograms, which is about 1,100 pounds of rice, was steamed this morning. We steam rice every morning at an average of 500 kilograms and max 1,000 kilograms, about 2,200 pounds.
It's a lot of rice every day. Okay. So there you can see they're entering the data on how much moisture the rice is absorbed. That way they can control it very precisely. And that affects every single step on down the process. So after steaming the rice and cooling it down, they'll take it into a special room, a special koji making room inside the brewery. And that's what we see happening there. So here he's shaking the koji mold spores onto the rice. Hashiba-san, why do they sprinkle the mold spores on the rice like that? Why don't they just mix it in and mix it all up thoroughly?
It allows us to control more precisely how the mold grows onto the rice.
I see, I see. So after they sprinkle the mold on there, they'll flip it over to make sure that the mold is getting evenly distributed and that the temperature is uniformly distributed as well. So when they make koji, for the first 24 hours or so, they wrap it up into a big pile like this. It keeps the moisture in, the temperature high, it allows the mold to start to grow fairly quickly. The temperature here is 30.3 degrees Celsius. Hashiba-san, why is the temperature so important when making koji?
Yeah, the enzymes that are created will vary with temperature. So we need to control that precisely to get the right enzymes, which will lead to optimal starch to sugar conversion.
Excellent, thank you. So on the morning or so of the second day, they'll open up that big bundle and then they'll break up the rice clumps into smaller things and put them into these trays. So here you're moving the koji from a big pile into the smaller trays. That looks like a lot of work. Why is that necessary?
Sure, you are right. The task is difficult, time-consuming, labor-intensive, and technically challenging. But it allows us to control each batch of rice by adjusting the temperature and humidity for the ideal sake.
Thank you. So what we're looking at now is completed koji. After 2 days or so, this is what the koji looks like. It kind of looks like rice with a bit of frosting on it, so to speak. They'll then take this koji and go take it and put it into one tank or another at one stage or another of the sake brewing process. That little tank into which he's dumping the koji is the yeast starter tank. That's the actual yeast. That's how they actually add the yeast. There's several ways to do it, but this is one of them. After about 2 weeks, that yeast starter will be ready, and I'll add more rice water and koji to it several times over 4 days.
Izumibashi 酒造では酒母作りにおいては、昔ながらの木本作りを大切にしています。現在酒作っている量の半分は木本作りで丁寧にやるように。
So this is the Kimoto method. They'll take all the rice and koji and water that's going to go into one yeast starter and split it up into several small vats and mix it up like this. Hashiba-san, can you explain how the traditional Kimoto method is different from the regular way of making a yeast starter?
Yeah, Kimoto is much more work. The rice, koji, and water are mixed slowly like this with pores. Also, temperature and moisture are much more tightly controlled. But the Kimoto method is also much stabler and predictable.
Thank you.
This 二酸化炭素、炭酸ガスがあるので危ないのでなかなか人間近寄れませんが、今日は特別に見ることができます。どうぞ。もろみが約30日ほどの発酵を終わりましたら、いよいよ、もろみを酒と酒粕に分ける作業、醸造になります。Izumibashi酒造ではすべて、酒袋を使った昔ながらの船搾りでお酒を搾っています。
Hashiba-san, why do you prefer this box press, the fune press like this, instead of the more commonly used machines that are obviously faster and easier to use?
Yeah, Izumibashi has two fune press machine and one automatic press machine, but we use fune press only. Fune press takes more work but easy to clean. About two and a half hours to stack sake bags. After that, it takes about 1 day for the pressing process. The finished sake, arabashiri, nakadori, and seme can be distinct, leading to a more stunning sake taste. In particular, the stacking of the sake bags requires a skillful technique. If there are sake making Olympic competition, Izumibashi workers will receive gold medals. Thank you.
Mr. Hashiba mentioned the three stages, the arabashiri, nakadori, and seme. As you press the sake, the different stages, the first part, the middle part, and the third part, can be separated into different types of sake if you press it that way. Excellent. Thank you for your commentary, Mr. Hashiba. What I'd like to do now is not that.
Thank you.
What I'd like to do now is to move on to the next part of the conversation, the next part of the presentation, which is going to be talking about some sake and food pairings. So why don't we dive right into that? And this will be the last part of tonight's presentation, but we'll move on to that. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it will work the way it's supposed to. And I believe that we should be doing okay here. So now I want to talk about a few sake from Kanagawa and some Kanagawa food that we can use, and we'll do some pairings right here. We have 5 sake that we'll be talking about tonight. Some of you may have purchased these in advance. If you haven't, please seek them and try them. They're all imported into the United States, and they're all from Kanagawa. We have 2 sake from a producer that makes a sake called Tensei. The producer is Kumazawa Shuzo. And I mentioned them as one of the other main popular brewery brands in Kanagawa. And then we've got 3 from Izumibashi, and we'll look at each one of those and some food with which they go well. And we can, hopefully everybody will either try them at home or go to the actual restaurants where they serve them. The first sake that we have is Tensei. It's a Jin Mai Ginjo. The English nickname it's been given is Song of the Sea. And it's a brewery that's in the southern part, very close to the ocean, in Kanagawa Prefecture. And the brewery has a number of restaurants on grounds, and they have a lot of Western food there. And we've done here, we've paired this with, the sake itself, it's very, very expressive in both its aromas and flavors. It uses a very special yeast. Yeast commonly used in sake brewing in Japan have numbers, number 7, number 9. And these were all discovered at one brewery or another. And this particular yeast, number 9, was discovered at a brewery way down south in Kumamoto Prefecture. Most people that use number 9 get it through a distributor that reproduces the yeast very purely. However, Tensei has a connection with the original founding brewery of this yeast, and they're able to get it directly from this brewery down in Kanagawa. I'm sorry, down in Kumamoto. And it gives a very, very lively, expressive flavor and aroma. So one thing about this particular sake, this Jin Mai Ginjo from Tensei, is that it's very expressive in both its aromas and in its flavors. Usually a sake will lean towards expressing aromas more or flavors more, but this particular one really has a great balance and is very expressive in many ways. You kind of got this medley of apple, banana, and melon that leads the aromas. It kind of carries through the entire flavor profile. Also, there's a bit of a sweetness and a minerality to the sake as well. It's fairly intense with a crisp, clean finish as well. Now, I think that the intensity of this sake, both in the flavors and aromas, bolstered by the slight sweetness, in the end, it kind of balances the salty, meaty flavors of the artisan hot dog as well as the BLT in particular. One of the restaurants on the grounds of this brewery serves Western food like this with a European influence, and it's really, really an exemplar case of a great example of how good sake, espresso sake, can go really, really well with Western food. So I encourage you to experiment with that as well. The next sake is from the same brewery. The last one was a Jin Mai Ginjo. This is a Tokubetsuhonjozo, and it's got the nickname Endless Summer. So Tokubetsuhonjozo means it's a special honjozo, and a honjozo means a bit of alcohol has been added to make it lighter and to bring out some of the aromas a bit more thoroughly. And this particular sake here, it's very crisp, it's very lively. And I think the lightness of it, the liveliness of the crispness of it, just kind of lightens up the sesame oil, as well as the tomato flavor in the pizza. So it's really, really a very, very, again, great pairing with Western food. Now, pizza is not an overpoweringly sharp or hot pizza, spicy pizza. It's more subtle in its aroma and its flavors. Furthermore, you've got shirasu on there. I mentioned earlier that shirasu are immature or baby sardines that are very, very small and served any number of ways, but they'll give a certain amount of minerality as well as, I think, umami to this that will bring out those same aspects in the sake well. So another great example of a lighter sake, and even though it's light, it will go very well with Western food as well. Next, we move into Izumibashi. We've got a line of Izumibashi called Megumi, and this is a Jinmai sake. I'm sorry, a Jinmai Ginjo. They're pairing it here, or we're pairing it here, with maguro dressed in taishu persimmon with peony grape, white sesame paste, and ricotta cheese. This sake tends to have a very elegant aroma and a very balanced palate as well. To me, the flavors and aromas have a really significant role in enhancing the creaminess, the umami, and the smoked nuts and flavors and aromas in the dish being served here. The ricotta cheese has a whole lot of umami to contribute to this, and the sesame paste adds its own nuttiness to it. And these elements are actually quite apparent in the sake as well, and they complement each other in both the dish and the sake. And by pairing them, both the sake and the food end up tasting a little bit better. Next, we move on to another sake from Izumibashi. This one is Ikimoto. We mentioned how Kimoto is made in a special way that brings out a bit more acidity, a much more fine-grained flavor, and a bit more umami in the sake. Furthermore, this sake has been aged for 2 years. Most sake is not aged. Kimoto is the kind of sake that will stand up to more age than most sake. Again, it tends to work wonders with the umami. But for having been a tier 8 sake in Kimoto, it's actually surprisingly light. And it's very layered flavor. You've got sweetness, acidity, umami, creating this very deep layered flavor. Drinking this one actually warm, a little bit warmer than average, really, really brings out a lot of really cool aspects of the sake. So we definitely want to recommend that. If you look at the margarita style sauce, there's actually 3 sauces used here. And the combination of them together with the sake itself brings out umami, acidity, and even a bit of really enjoyable bitterness. And together they end up resembling the flavors of a margarita sauce. If this medium rare tuna and the sake themselves are about the same temperature, the acidity and the umami just superbly blend and give you a really, really, really enjoyable and somewhat unique pairing to the sake, between the sake and the food. And the last one we're going to look at, it's a Jinmai Genshu sake, again, under the Megumi sub-brand of Izumibashi. Genshu means undiluted, and typically most sake can end up with alcohol contents between 18 and 20%, but they almost always water that down to about 16%. If they don't, that's known as Genshu. Now, Genshu can have higher alcohol content, but it doesn't always. In this particular sake, the fact that it's Genshu does not make it overpowering. It bolsters the flavors and aromas a little bit. It gives you a bit more, it kind of enhances the sweetness and the acidity and the umami as well, because the alcohol is a little bit higher. And the bitterness becomes a bit more apparent as well in a good way. But it's also got very traditional Ginjo aromas. You see some pear, you see some melon, you see some banana in the aromas here. Both the acidity in the sake and the dryness are quite prominent, and there's umami that kind of suffuses all that. So when you warm it up, as we recommend here, warming it up, it mellows out and broadens the flavor, just makes it something completely different that's extremely comforting. So we highly recommend that as well. The warmth of the sake, should you choose to warm it, and the piercing acidity and the dryness kind of balance out the fattiness of the toro and kind of work as a backdrop to the complex flavors of the Welsh onion teriyaki. So another really, really good pairing that kind of straddles Western food and Japanese food and goes very well with sake. So with that, we would like to wrap up this section and the major part of the presentation for the evening. I'd like to thank everybody for sitting through it all. We hope you enjoyed the discussion on both Izumibashi Sake Brewing, how they grow their rice, and the sake of Kanagawa Prefecture in general. And we hope you enjoyed the whole evening. If you didn't have a chance to purchase a sake in advance, please seek out the sake of Kanagawa and experiment with food of your own choice at home. So again, thank you very much for listening tonight. And at this point in time, I would like to switch over to Mr. Suzuki, who will say a few final words on the evening.
Thank you, John-san. Thank you, Hashiba-san. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hitoshi Suzuki, Director of Kanagawa Division at Jet New York. I'd like to introduce you to 3 online features related to this program. All are posted on the Japan Society's website, so you can enjoy them from the comfort of your own home. Next, please. Okay, first I'd like to introduce some online tourism resources we have created as part of this special series. It's difficult to travel to Japan right now because of coronavirus, but I will be introducing the charm of Hakone and Kamakura, 2 of Kanagawa Prefecture's most popular tourism destinations. Okay, next please. Okay, in the introduction to Kamakura, you can learn more about Zen and the vegetarian cuisine, which is called Shojin Ryori. In Kamakura, the center of Zen Buddhism in Japan, there are many restaurants serving Shojin Ryori, Zazen or seated meditation, experiences at Zen temples in Kamakura are well known, but be sure to visit Kamakura for Shojin Ryori. Next, please. Okay, secondly, I'd like to introduce you to our virtual exhibition. It's an exhibition of Kamakura bori carving, a traditional craft born in Kamakura. You will see the history of Kamakura bori carving, the transition of its style, and an example of the carving process. There is also video content introducing the leading Kamakura bori carving maker Hakudo. Okay, next please. Finally, I will introduce the virtual pop-up shop. We have teamed up with 2 food subscription companies to sell Kanagawa boxes. One is an assortment of snacks, and the other is an assortment of natural food. I really wish we could hold a tasting event so you could taste them in person. You have a special discount code for you on the website that you can use for purchasing. These boxes are only available for a limited time, so make sure to get yours soon. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our speakers tonight for the enlightening glimpse into Kanagawa sake, and thank you to everyone who has joined us from all over the world for this program. I'm Tomomi Sekiya, Director of the Talks Plus program at Japan Society. All the contents that were introduced tonight is, we have a link in the description box below, so please click and visit our online contents for Get to Know Kanagawa series. And if you have a moment, please fill out a short survey about this program. You can find a link in the description below as well. We appreciate your feedback and hope to see you again at future Japan Society programs. Thank you and good night.